Okay, so I'm going to talk about my project in a slightly different context. I think, I try to approach things objectively, but of course we all bring our own experiences to whatever we do. And so I think I wanted to give a little bit of context. So that's me with the baby goats.
That's you?
Yeah, that's me laying in a pile of baby goats. Anyway, if you've never experienced goats intimately, I highly recommend it. So anyway, like I was trying to say, I'm just going to run through some projects that I've done before really briefly to try to give you an idea of how I brought myself into this project, and then I'll talk specifically about it. So I was born and raised on Long Island, close to a 5,500 acre natural area, which seems tiny now that I live here, and about a mile from the Long Island Sound. And I spent most of my childhood just being in these spaces, exploring these spaces, and it became a refuge for me and also completely shaped who I am today. And as I got older, I started to realize that all these areas that I considered to be quote-unquote nature were actually second and third growth forests filled with introduced and invasive species, old industrial sites, and waste dumps. And these spaces were not only affected by humans, but were almost completely transformed and in many cases intentionally shaped by them. So as I began to sort of explore these ideas as an artist and began to mature as an artist, I became really interested in the profound and long-ranging impact of human activities on what we think of as nature, and also how our understanding of the world, how it's shaped and controlled through information and images produced by the disciplines of science and art primarily. So I began to make work that was research-driven and had the outward appearance of displays you might find in a natural history museum. So this is a project I made. It's kind of an exploration of the history or the unnatural history of the European starling in North America. I'm not going to talk about it, but if you don't know the story, it's fascinating. So these animals were intentionally introduced in New York in 1890, and they're now one of the most common and familiar birds in all of North America. I also became really interested in scientific taxonomies and how naming things is used as a way both to understand them, but also to maintain power over them, and power over how we understand the natural world. So I began work on this project about a dozen years ago. This is an ongoing project, which centers around the invention of my own new taxonomy for these things, which I have identified as very small objects. They can be natural or man-made. They just have to be a particular size. So the project exists as an active functional taxonomy that anybody can use, and also as a large archive and an image database of these things that are ever expanding. I have hundreds and hundreds of them now. This is just another display of how, and I've exhibited these things all over the place. So I was working through these things, but it really wasn't until I moved to this landscape, which if none of you have ever experienced this is Central Illinois, post-harvest, that I really began to understand the completeness of humans' impact on the environment. So living in the middle of this vast monoculture of industrial scale corn and soybeans made me start to really wonder, was there any remnants? Where do the animals go? Where are the remnants of native plants and everything? Because truly, I mean, the landscape is dominated by non-natural spaces. So this question, through research and exploration on my own, eventually led me to this space, which is the Interstate Highway right-of-way, which is a fascinating little remnant of land. And I spent over a year intimately exploring 116 miles of highway right-of-way on this project called the Highway Expedition. So I collected objects, used videos, photographs, handmade journals, dioramas, and other objects for the exhibition that's really investigating this site as a unique ecosystem and habitat, which is kind of weird and interesting. All right, so that experience also led me to begin a new tactic in my work, which is instead of just documenting and representing my experience of these places, I started initiating opportunities for solving problems and possibly making bad situations a little better. So in the case of the highway expedition, what I did was I made and distributed seed balls filled with locally native prairie seeds for people to throw out their windows into the median. which is technically littering, which you can get fined for, but so implicating the participants in this illegal activity. So the idea was to increase native plant biodiversity in that space. All right, so this project also led to the creation of this thing, which is a partly fictional organization that I'm president and founder of, called the Society for a Re-Natural Environment, more commonly known as the SRNE. So this is a multifaceted, non-governmental, re-environmental organization dedicated to identifying, protecting, and occasionally enhancing sites that are partly or wholly transformed and dominated by human activities. So this is urban, suburban, large-scale agriculture, industrial sites like that. So that's primarily what I'm interested in. So the organization strives to educate the public about often overlooked everyday experiences of wild non-human plants and animals in order to reconnect with and shift ideas about what we conventionally think of and label as nature. We also work to inform the public about past and current examples of humanity's impact on local and global ecosystems. And through this work, we hope to inspire people to make choices that are ideally less destructive to the environment than previous generations. All right, so this is the next project that I did specifically under the banner of the SRNE. And this was an unsanctioned land acquisition program. Yes. It worked, though. So the idea was to stop harmful mowing and chemical spraying in unused or underutilized green spaces. So challenging the idea that if you have green space, of course you should manage it by mowing, period. We don't like that. So I invented these signs. And so I was taking advantage of the general public's respect for the appearance of authority. And it worked incredibly well. And so I would just put these signs in at random spots, and the people who were managing the space were like, okay, we don't mow that anymore. So I did a whole bunch of these, and they worked really well. There were a couple of challenges, a couple of problems, but a bunch of them are still in existence today. This is actually across from the brand new Performing Arts Center in Kansas City, and it's still there. All right, so I've been following this trajectory of research-driven projects about human impacts on a lot of different ecosystems, and there's a ton that I have that I'm not going to have time to talk about. But I want to talk about just a couple more before talking about this project here. And this is the last one I did before leaving Illinois. This is called On the Impact of Flying Carp. And so this is a project looking at the current invasion of silver and bighead carp in the waterways of the Mississippi Basin, and the very serious threat these animals pose to the ecology of the Great Lakes. They say if they get into the Great Lakes, the ecology of the Great Lakes will collapse because they eat plankton and they'll eat the bottom of the food chain. So how did they get here? How did they become a big problem? So it was a combination basically of misguided aquaculture practices and an increase of flood events in the region. They were brought in to be natural biofilters for aquaculture ponds, and then it flooded and they got out, and that was it. So the project that I did for this basically raises awareness and also proposes and promotes the idea that I didn't come up with, but promotes the idea that we can combat their numbers by eating them. They're actually very tasty. All right, speaking of eating, so this is the first project I made after moving to Vermont. And this is, I was commissioned to make this project of Land and Local, the first iteration of that amazing series of exhibitions. And this is an informational, culinary, and design-based project to encourage people to combat locally invasive plants by harvesting, cooking, and eating them. So the project is basically a field guide cookbook, a series of posters, and a website. All right, Pine Island. When Corey first approached me about this project, my instant response was very positive. This is kind of what I do, and the opportunity to spend a year investigating this site and making a project from it I was very enthusiastic about that. And also being able to do this kind of extensive project in my new adopted home of Vermont, which I adore now, so was too good to pass up. So I went out to the site in July of last year, and I was really enthusiastic about this site. It's a fascinating, beautiful space. It's got a lot of, the landscape itself is interesting, the past and recent history, the biological and cultural diversity, the mission of the Goat Collaborative, speaking specifically to the cultural diversity at the site, and especially the positive impact that that has on the new American community is just really awe-inspiring. And then came the goats themselves, which I don't know, I've never been around goats before at all, and I just totally fell in love with them. They're fascinating animals. They're smart, playful, charismatic, and I struggled a little bit because, of course, the goats here are raised for meat, right? So, you know, I forced myself to actually attend a slaughter and butchering, which is a little tough to watch after developing a relationship, but it's part of what they do, and it's, you know, I mean, these goats, otherwise, I don't know if you know this, but baby goats from goat dairy farms, males, are culled at birth and thrown into a compost pile. So at least they got to have, you know, they get to have a nicer life until they get turned into food. So I would go out and shoot photos and videos, and the goats were always very interested and try to nibble and chew on all those things that I had, which was fun. So I came up with the idea of dividing the site into 4 sections that were outlined by the Land Trust map: farm, hayfield, wetland, and river forest. And I documented these spaces at regular intervals, usually around once or twice a month for the year, over the course of the whole year, so I was out when it was sub-zero. The idea was to divide these connected spaces and then reconnect them visually by gleaning small sections of photos from the over 3,000 that I took during that year and composing them into the banner prints that you see in the gallery. So the finished prints visually depict the seasonal, agricultural, and cultural cycles and the interplay with the ecological and agricultural systems present at the site. That's basically the idea. So each section affects the others as a connected whole, extending, of course, to the whole intervale region and beyond. And the accompanying video is supposed to provide an audio-visual backdrop for the prints and the sculpture by alternating with the non-English-speaking farmers that you can hear in the background of the shot of the barn, with the goats interacting with the landscape and sort of emerging out of the landscape themselves. So the issue of flooding at the site came up in early conversations because right when I got there, they had just had these huge floods, and the island was actually cut off for a period of time. The farmers were cut off because of these floods. And of course, there are predictions of more frequent flood events due to climate change. And this inspired me to do my strategy of creating something that could possibly positively impact it by creating these goat boats, which is feasible and perhaps fantastical solution to this problem of how to pasture these animals. And a bit of research, of course, showed that this flooding problem and how to manage animals during these events happen all over the world. So I'll just end with the image of this thing that I invented, goat boat. You can see those little screw eyes. This is actually, the idea is that a single unit is not really terribly stable, but you can make tons of them. The materials are inexpensive, if not free, and you can make them, you know, as many as you want. Make a huge area of these things that the goats can go out, and goats being who they are and what they are will use it for sure. Anyway, that's all I have. Thank you.